Hi, so I want to carry forward our discussion of, excuse me, Heidegger's book Being and Time. I want to turn now to chapter 1 of Division 2. Um, and we're going to pick up on that theme of authenticity that we've been starting to talk about. Um, but we talked about it, I guess, very briefly when we talked about the they and so on, that chapter, and then we start talking about it last time when we were talking about authenticity or anxiety. Excuse me. So we're going to address it more directly now, but we're going to come at it through a different theme, and that theme will become apparent in a minute. But I want to begin by just looking at the something from the beginning of section 46, from the beginning of chapter 1. So this is basically pages 279 and 280. I want to look down here about 10 lines down. So the beginning of that second paragraph, start with the second sentence. Yet the primary item in care is the ahead of itself. And this means that in every case Dasein exists for the sake of itself. What does that mean? Mostly what it means is you ongoingly live in such a way that you're on the way somewhere. Some projects are underway for you. And so, like even right now, I'm doing something towards the goal of completing a little lecture, and so the very activity I'm engaged in now doesn't have its meaning exhausted in the now, right? The thing I'm doing now is already defined by something that according to the clock hasn't happened yet, namely the end of the lecture. So it's if we're speaking experientially, according to the clock, the end of the lecture hasn't happened yet. But according to my lived way of inhabiting time, the end of the lecture is here with me already, right? I'm always engaging with it already. And so that's kind of the very meaning of how we have an experience of time, how we have an experience of the now. We always experience the moment now in relationship to a future that we have projected, not necessarily reflectively or explicitly, but we're working at something. So we're already, in a sense, at the end point, in that what we do now is defined by it, and we kind of work back from where we're trying to get to. That says what we're going to do now. So the now is already defined by an end. So the future is already alive in the now, and the past is still alive, because at every moment the actions I undertake make sense because of where they stand with respect to what has already happened. And even more, it's just like they're the carrying on of something. Like if I start picking up my pen, I have to keep doing it, and that the activity of picking it up isn't a series of absolutely discrete moments. First I do this, then I do this, then I do this, then I do this. There's a single activity in which the act of picking up the pen sort of unfolded. And each moment, the moments aren't really separable. Each moment is kind of the continuation and completion of the preceding one. And it's already the kind of inauguration and holding in advance of the next one. So that's true at sort of at the level of motion, but I mean especially at the level of me doing it, right? Of my activity of picking up the pen is something that doesn't happen in a moment. It endures. It has a duration. It endures over a stretch of time, and that time is all of the sort of points of that time are inherently defined by their relationship to the other ones. One of the most striking ways to notice that, I think, is listening to music. When you listen to music, you hear, actually, let me start that sentence again. Let's go back to what Heidegger said about, sounds. Like you hear a car, you don't hear a sound. Similarly, in reading, you get a story, you don't exactly see words on a page, right? Phenomenologically speaking. Well, similarly then, when listening to music, you hear a tune. And it's true that tune is enacted through separate notes and beats and whatever else, but it's more like you hear something being said, not a sentence or a word, but there's a kind of musical meaning that is a melody, and of course, you know it's notes, and if someone says, "Can you go back and tell me what those notes are?" Maybe you can sing it, or maybe you can't. But you don't hear it typically as a series of discrete notes. You hear it as kind of a musical line, right? But then sometimes you do notice the notes, or at least they're always sort of obviously quite important. And sometimes there's a really striking one, like or like what the Beethoven, like da 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 da. Of course, those are a number of discrete notes, but you hear them as kind of units. The da 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 is a kind of a gesture almost, and da 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 is a kind of a gesture. But it's interesting that second one, the very way you hear it, responds to the first one. Like it's only because the first one went da 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 that you hear the difference of the second one going da 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 da, and it's like the first one sets something up and the second one kind of settles it or answers it. But if you never heard that first one first, if you just heard the da 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 da, you wouldn't hear it as answering, and you wouldn't hear it in the same way. And indeed, the last note, so it goes da 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 da. If you drop all that and just heard da, doesn't mean anything. Just a note. Da could be da, could be da, could be da. Doesn't matter what it is, just a note. But when you hear that note at the end of that phrase, da 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 da, that note doesn't just have its own meaning. It has the meaning of all that other thing built into it, and what you hear is its sense with respect to that whole. You hear it basically as completing a kind of a movement. And then you could say analogous things about the notes in between, like the third one, da da da. You probably never even thought to single that one out before, but that one was carrying something forward, and it was setting up the da 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 da. Right? The third note does a bit of work of getting you to anticipate that next one, so much so that you really don't even notice the third one particularly, but you notice that fourth one. So all of the notes are carrying forward the movement and setting up the next part, where the very first one, the da, inaugurates things, and the very last one ends at da, right? Of course, there's more of a song around it, but more of a tune around it. But just even in that phrase, it goes from somewhere to somewhere. And the sounds play a musical role for you by the way they relate to the others and how they carry on something that was moving through those notes and take it somewhere. And that's what you hear. You hear the contour, right? And so the significance of the individual notes you hear is not their pure individuality, like this is a note that has a frequency of 492 hertz or something like that. Like it's rather you hear it as the role it's playing in carrying on and passing on this thing. It's almost like a relay rider, getting the baton and moving it to the next rider. But so that melodies demonstrate, I think, very powerfully how in your hearing, you hear what's happening now as carrying on a past and anticipating a future. Right? So in the now, you are still holding on and already projecting something. So anyway, Dasein is always ahead of itself. Well, that's true. That thing I just said is true at every level. It's not just listening to notes in a melody. Like all the things you're doing are the latest note, so to speak, in the melody that is either carrying out the lecture or eating dinner or buying groceries, or the larger one, carrying out your life. So the things you're doing are always already defined by something that exceeds that moment now. But so that's not something that just happens on some occasions. That's the very meaning, the very character of our experience of time, the very character of our experience. That experience is always happening, and in that happening of experience for us, the future is already there. Already there in the sense that we're already ahead of ourselves at a future, and that's what lets the moment mean something. We could say an analogous thing about the past too. For our purposes here, that's not so important. So I'm just thinking about the ahead of itself. So that's what he means. But now, so you could read down a little bit further. If you go up about 6 lines from the bottom of the page on 279, the ahead of itself as an item in the structure of care, right? That it's the very structure of it. It's not like something that might or might not happen. It's the very way we have experience, right? The ahead of itself as an item in the structure of care tells us unambiguously that in Dasein there is always something still outstanding, which as a potentiality for being for Dasein itself has not yet become actual. I mean, he's later going to go on to play a little bit about just what exactly it means to say something still outstanding, but what he means by that is, it's like when somebody owes you a debt. You say, well, you still have a debt outstanding, right? There's still something yet to be done to complete this story. So it's in the very meaning of the kind of thing you are that there's something still unfinished, so to speak, something still waiting to be done. So he refers to that as a lack of totality. So this is a powerful point to start thinking about. There's something about the very nature of you as an experiencing being that can't be totalized. Like you're sort of open-ended. You're never all there, because your reality is always in a way waiting on something that's still outstanding. Right? You're always already defined by something that has not happened yet, something that has not been made real yet. The title of this chapter is Dasein's Possibility of Being a Whole, and so you can see this theme about totality is going to resonate with that chapter. Like, in what sense can you be a whole when you're sort of open-ended? Anyway. But he says, well, think about this other thing. So turning the page on the top of the page, he says, well, as soon as Dasein exists, so to speak, in such a way that absolutely nothing more is still outstanding in it, right? If it ever came to be the case that you had no more future, you'd be dead, right? As soon as Dasein exists in such a way that absolutely nothing more is still outstanding in it, then it has already, for this very reason, become no longer Dasein, right? If it ever were the case that there was nothing further happening, you wouldn't be experiencing anymore. You would no longer be Dasein, right? The very meaning of Dasein is that you are constitutively defined by, as he's going to use this language in a minute, and not yet. It's not done yet. So as he says, the reason for the impossibility of experiencing Dasein ontically as a whole doesn't lie in any imperfection in our cognitive powers. The hindrance lies rather in the very being of this entity. I'm not going to dwell on that theme, but that was the title, and I mentioned it a minute ago. Like, if you say, like, what does it take to get a person together as a whole? Well, you can't. Not because you don't know enough, but because the very nature of a person is that they can't be a whole, at least not in that sense. Okay, so that's the thing I wanted to start you with. Now let's skip ahead to page 295. And we're actually going to talk about death, the very thing we just mentioned. Because we want to think about, he spends a lot of time in these chapters, pages I'm not going to talk about right here. You can read them. But I'm not going to talk about. He says, in what sense can we talk about an end to Dasein? You talk about an end of a song. You can talk about an end of a game. In what sense can you talk about an end of Dasein? And he's trying to show various ways in which the normal ways we think about an end don't make sense. One is the one that I just gave, right? If you were to, actually, I'll go back and read him where he says this, because that's worth reading. I could have read this on page 281. This is the start of section 47. If you imagine Dasein reaching its wholeness in death, because there is no more, it would seem like you have a whole, but you're actually going to be too late, right? Because he says, when Dasein reaches its wholeness in death, so to speak, it simultaneously loses the being of its there, right? As soon as it ends, you're not experiencing it anymore. Like, by definition, you can't experience your own death, because death is that time at which you're no longer experiencing. So, by its transition to being no longer Dasein, no longer there, it gets lifted right out of the possibility of experiencing this transition, and therefore out of the possibility of understanding it or encountering it as something experienced. So you, like, the very nature of your death is that you can't experience it. So to the extent that Dasein is the act of experiencing, death can't actually be an event within Dasein. It can't really be an event for Dasein. So we're in a funny spot. How to think about our own death, and how to think about the obviously related idea of what it is for Dasein to be a whole, or what it is for Dasein to end. Anyway, so let me go back now to what I was going to read. So basically what he wants to say here is the relevant thing about death for Dasein, for you or for me, for human beings. Anything can die. Rabbits die. Trees die. Like there is a biological phenomenon of death that we're familiar with from the world around us. In fact, I had a picture I was going to show. Maybe I'll show it right now. You see a lot of these things. This is a picture by a painter named Peter Boyle. Just called Still Life with the Dead Game. But it's one of a lot of paintings you'd see of this type that usually pictures of, hunting trophies, basically. So it's funny to see these instead of the, beautiful landscapes and so on. It's just pictures of dead animals, sometimes with their sliced open with their insides shown or whatever. So on the one hand, you can say, okay, it makes sense. They're just showing their hunting trophies, or they're showing the nice dinner they have. But that seems to sort of miss the point that they're pretty obviously pictures of dead things, and that in a way, what's being put on display is that I killed them. And I just wanted to show that picture and have you think of pictures like that for two reasons. One is to just give you an objective portrayal of death, right? The portrayal of an entity that is dead. And then I'll come back and say something about that. But the other reason is also just to suggest that you think about a kind of fascination, I think, that we humans, or many people, have often had with death, both with our ability to kill, and that's a striking theme in its own right, but also just the phenomenon of death. And I'm not going to really try to psychoanalyze that, talk about that in great detail, but I just want you to think about it, and I want to just give a kind of, I think, a sort of straightforward, plausible thing. Like, we're fascinated with death because of our concern with our own death, and so there's a way in which our own death is very puzzling to us and pretty important, and we'll see a little bit more about why. But it's an enigma, and the enigma of our own death sort of prompts us to try to grapple with that and understand that, and that in many ways leads to a kind of interest in or fascination with death, and maybe looking to worldly instances of death in the hope that they might give us some insight into our own reality. There's a film by an Argentinian filmmaker whose name I can't immediately remember, but it's called Man Facing Southeast. What's the name of that director? Can't remember. Man Facing Southeast. It's a fine film. I highly recommend seeing it. It should be on the list of films that educated people interested in these kinds of things watch. But one of the striking scenes in it is there's a guy in there who's a little bit crazy, and he's trying to understand himself and his own problems. And one of the things there's a scene where he's kind of fascinated with looking at the brains of dead animals and so on. And I think the scene communicates pretty much the same thing I've tried to say here. Like, we look to those things in the world in the hope that if we just cut them open or look in them, they're going to reveal to us the secrets about ourselves that we grapple with. But it's, of course, the wrong kind of approach. It's not going to do that. And we'll talk a little bit about why in a minute. But anyway, I just wanted to put that on your mind, that kind of thought on your mind. But let's get back to this. So Heidegger says, well, how are we going to think about our own death and so on? And so, yeah, to the extent that you are an entity in the world, remember way back at the beginning when we looked at that Manet painting, on the one hand, the painting of the bar at the Folies Bergère portrayed our perspective. So it portrayed you as a subject, But on the other hand, it looked like you could see reflected in the mirror that you as an object in the world, right? And so from the very beginning, we looked at those two sorts of things. Like, in some sense, you are an object in the world. It's just not a perspective you can fully adopt on yourself. But, insofar as you're that, presumably you're going to die. Everybody else does. But that's not the existentially relevant sense of death, right? That's something that's going to happen to an object. But we're interested in you as a subjectivity, and we ask, like, what is subjectivity to you? What is the meaning of death experientially? And the thing is, you can't experience it, as he was just saying. You can't be there for it. But here's the interesting thing: you can't experience it, but you can do something which we're actually engaging in right now and talking about it. You can have experience that is sort of defined by and oriented to that fact of your death. And so he says on 293, it's in section 50, we had to reject various interpretations of Dasein's not yet that were interpreting it in a worldly fashion, he says. But what we're going to have instead is being at an end implies existentially being toward the end. The uttermost not yet has the character of something towards which Dasein comports itself, right? We can comport ourselves, we can live out of an orientation towards the reality of our, let me use this word, the reality of our mortality. In other words, not so much a focus on the biological or the chronological worldly fact of our death, which will presumably take place according to the rest of the world. But we can be oriented towards the reality that our experience, to go back to the theme I sort of started with, our experience is happening now, and it's happening in this now. It's not eternal and infinite, and it's not some other time. You're living now in this finite and, in a certain way, contingent circumstance. I guess the thing I really want to stress is you're living only now. That's what death really means. Like, you won't get a second chance at it. There's not going to be another one. You don't get to run through for 60 years or 90 years and say, yeah, you know what, I don't like the way I did that. Now that I practiced it, I'm going to go through my childhood and adolescence and early adulthood again, and I'm going to do it right this time. You don't get that. So there is a way you can relate to your death which is misguided, which is to adopt that sort of biologically worldly view on it, and we'll maybe talk about that a bit more in a minute. But what would be the sort of authentic way, or the way to take it up that is actually meaningful as a dimension of your existence? You can live in a way that acknowledges your mortality, which is the same as saying it acknowledges your finitude. You're acknowledging both you're acknowledging that this is the one and only time this is happening for you. Another way of saying that is, this is the one and only time it matters. So we've been picking up on the theme of mattering before when we were talking about being in and care and so on. Well, now this life is when it matters for you. It's the only time it can matter. So he says on 294, first of all, just carrying on with sort of trying to define sort of what we mean by death, he says, death is the possibility of the absolute impossibility of Dasein. Right? This is a real meaningful dimension of what it is to be you, namely that there will be a time when it will be impossible to be you, because it'll be done. Right? So you can live in a way that's oriented towards that possibility of your own impossibility, right? But then he says in 295, And well, he also says that's your own most possibility that cannot be outstripped, which means, in other words, it's the possibility uniquely definitive of you. There's no way around it. Nobody else can take it over, right? But it is at the core of the very meaning of what it is to be you as an act of experiencing. To be an act of experiencing kind of means that you were born. It means like it started happening and it's happening. But the this one is happening here and now also means it's the one that's going to die, right? Because it's happening here and now, not at those other times, not at some other time. So the very meaning of having a perspective is sort of implicitly, or let me say that sentence differently, the possibility of your own impossibility is built into the very meaning of you having a perspective. Your perspective is limited, and that means the limits kind of already define what it is. So the it's not happening anymore is a meaning in relationship to which it actually is happening is kind of already defined, right? Anyway, he says, so we just as we're sort of thrown into the world in general, or we are thrown into the world, like this is the brute fact, I'm here now with this, right? That thrownness into the world is also in a way thrownness into death for the same reason I just gave. Like because you're thrown into finitude, right? You're thrown into the one and onlyness of this experience while it's lasting, while it's going on. So that you are thrown into death is intrinsic, is a meaning intrinsic in all your experience, but you might or might not typically notice it. But so let's read what he says on 295. Thrownness, this is about 8 or 9 lines down, thrownness into death reveals itself to Dasein in a more primordial, impressive manner in that state of mind which we called anxiety. And so the thing we were talking about before is that frame of mind in which you're particularly set up to notice your mortality. We already said anxiety individualizes. Well, this is almost the same point. Like anxiety gets you to realize I'm the one and only one who's taken care of my act of experiencing. And this is a further development of what it means to be the one and only one who is living this life, right? Mortality is a flip side of what we were saying before. So he says anxiety then is not just a accidental or random kind of psychological weakness or something. He says rather it is a basic state of mind. It's like one of the most fundamental moods that is possible and definitive of Dasein. It's a basic state of mind of Dasein. It amounts to the disclosedness of the fact that Dasein exists as thrown being towards its end. Right? Anxiety is a possibility for human beings in a way that presumably it's not for the dog or the cat. And why is it a possibility? Because we're the very kind of being that can recognize that one and onlyness of the finitude of our perspective. Or, said otherwise, we're the kind of being that can recognize our own mortality. So the next section, 51, he goes on and talks about how they understand death, how death is construed in our average everydayness. And so he says on 297, death is encountered as a well-known event occurring within the world. Right? That's how it's talked about all the time. And we have already talked about why that's the wrong way to think of your death. But then later down on 297, just right around half, maybe a little below half, he says, dying, which is essentially mine in such a way that no one can be my representative, is perverted into an event of public occurrence which the they encounters. Right? This thing that is quite unique to you turns out to be just a public event for everybody. Right? It's again part of the misrepresentation. And then here, the thing right after that, about 3 or 4 lines after that, he says, by such ambiguity, Dasein puts itself in the position of losing itself in the they as regards a distinctive potentiality for being which belongs to Dasein's own most self. The they gives its approval and aggravates the temptation to cover up from oneself one's own most being towards death. So that seems pretty important, right? That's the idea that we live in a kind of flight from our own freedom, right? Our normal sense of what it is to be doing things right is actually to be fleeing from our own most being. And here he's showing how that is taken up, particularly with respect to death, that authentic relationship to our own death, which in a way is the most liberating thing, is precisely the thing that we're in a way discouraged from doing as death is interpreted in this sort of worldly way. So what should you be doing instead of that? Well, he says about a dozen lines down on 303. In Dasein, as being towards its death, its own uttermost not yet has already been included, that not yet which all others lie ahead of. That I think that sentence is pretty interesting, and I wanted to underline that and get you to think about it. And this relates to my talking about time before. So I was saying that the way we live time, our lived temporality, right, the way our very existence takes time and has a temporal dimension. I said we live time in terms of being on the way to something, such that we're carrying a past with us, as we're already ahead of ourselves at our objective. Talking that way showed that Dasein is always not yet. You're not yet done, right? And we're always dealing with not yets. So in using language that's a little bit paradoxical, but he's making a pretty profound point here. He says, this not yet is the one that all other not yets lie ahead of. What he means by that is, we always live in terms of not yets. I haven't yet finished this lecture. I haven't yet, whatever the other things are, right? But there is a definitive not yet. Right? I'm not yet dead, and I'm not yet finished, and so on. When you comport yourself authentically towards your own death, you're kind of living in light of that not yet, because you're living in light of your own mortality. You're taking your own mortality seriously, so to speak. You're embracing the finitude and therefore the absoluteness of this time. Right? This is the only time you've got. This is the only time when it matters for you. And so embracing your own mortality is recognizing that, and that means you're living from the not yet of your own death. You're living from this particular issue we've been talking about that most essential possibility for our being, which is our impossibility, in the sense he was saying. And so that living in relationship to that becomes the primary meaningful context for your life, in relationship to which all the other projects get their meaning. And so in that sense, all those other projects sort of come after this one. So in that sense, those not yets are ahead of this not yet. Or another way of putting it is, this end is in a sense the beginning that lets other things, other more local things, have ends, and so on. Anyway, so I hope that clarified it a little bit. But I'd like you to reflect on that sentence, right? In Dasein, as being towards its death, its own uttermost not yet has already been included, that not yet which all others lie ahead of. I think that's what he means, and I'd like you to think about that idea of making your mortality, in a sense, the first principle of your living. So I just want to read a few more things here. So with respect to that, so I'm talking about now the opposite of the they's approach to death would be the authentic approach to death, which is owning up to your own death, making your death your own. You can't actually experience it as an event, but you can essentially live in light of it. So I just talked about then making that not yet, in a way, the definitive aspect of your life. So in a way, you're living, in the language he uses here, you're living in anticipation of your death. So he uses he talks about anticipation here. He says, what are we going to mean by that word? We're going to say anticipate, not in the sense that you're looking forward to it or you're waiting for it to happen or something like that, but anticipate just in the sense of, well, I guess what I said, living in light of. Living now insofar as this now is already defined by that. So that's what he calls that anticipation. And so he says on 307 in that paragraph that begins in the middle of the page, the second line, in the anticipatory revealing of this potentiality for being, Dasein discloses itself to itself as regards its uttermost possibility. So in that sense, anticipation turns out to be the possibility of understanding one's own most and uttermost potentiality for being. That is to say, this is the possibility for authentic existence, right? This is where what it is to be an experiencing being really comes to be manifest to you, right? The distinctive reality, your distinctive reality as this finite happening of experience, is what you are encountering. So there's a kind of self-knowledge here, right? But it's in that embrace of your mortality and what comes with that for the first time you're in a way becoming your own self. You're owning your own reality. And I want to just read one more quotation and then we'll wrap this up and set you up for the next one. And so 310 he says, anxiety is the experience where we encounter this. And then he says, I just want to read this last line on 311. Anticipation, the authentic relationship to your own death, reveals to Dasein its lostness in the they self and brings it face to face with the possibility of being itself, primarily unsupported by concernful solicitude, but of being itself rather in an impassioned freedom towards death. A freedom which has been released from the illusions of the day and which is factical, certain of itself, and anxious. The thing he says there is good. It's kind of colorful language, but that's a good one to turn to just to try to see the thing he's saying here. But so we've been talking about this experience that, anxiety, like maybe the anxiety of the pandemic, an anxiety induced by that, you're really coming up against your reality as a free being who has to make sense of your life, of a life. And what anxiety offers you is the opportunity to recognize and embrace your own mortality, and then the flip side of that, to notice that you've been one of them and to take on a new way of living, and really to own, to make yourself answerable to the unique responsibilities that come to you as this unique perspective who is living out the one and only time when anything can matter to you, and when you can do anything that matters. So I'm going to leave that there. That's the end of our discussion of death. So we've done anxiety and being towards death, and these have been two steps towards defining for us what it is to live authentically, in contrast to living as a they self. And so we're going to conclude our study of Heidegger here with the next chapter, Division 2, Chapter 2, and we're going to talk about the experience of conscience, which I especially encourage you to read in conjunction with Lesson 10, with the beginning of Chapter 4, Insights of Exposure, which is about conscience. So that's what we're about to turn to.